Welcome back. We're going to continue on our handout. We were in the middle of things here discussing being and our most basic belief. And we're on this part down here now where we're talking about something must be eternal. We got here because we said that there are two kinds of existence and it is eternal or temporal. There are two kinds of being, matter or spirit. We also talked about our most basic concept is about existence, and existence is eternal or temporal. So our most basic belief was about eternal existence. Now I want to give an argument that we've given before, but now here it is in writing, so maybe it'll be easier to commit to memory, that something must be eternal. Remember we did this earlier on the square of opposition when I drew that picture and we went over it. But here's the argument again. So the contradiction, the opposite of something must be eternal, is nothing is eternal. And we're going to argue that this position leads to absurdity, and so it's not metaphysically possible for nothing to be eternal, and so it's not logically possible. It's not an option for us if reason applies to being. All right, so here's the argument. We're just analyzing the meaning of the terms. What does it mean to say nothing is eternal? Remember, meaning is more basic than truth. What does it mean to say nothing is eternal? It's the same as saying all is non-eternal or all is temporal. And that's the same as saying all came into being. So if it's temporal, it came into being. It had a beginning. So if all came into being, it all had a beginning, and if it all had a beginning, the very first thing had a beginning, which implies the very first thing came from non-being. All right, now we talked about being can't come from non-being, but let's think about why. Being can't come from non-being. Being can't come from non-being because of the way we define the terms. Being, which is what this handout is about, minimally exists, and it has properties, and it has the power to be, and non-being has no properties, it doesn't exist, and it has no power to be. So you can't get something like being, which has power, from something that has no power, non-being. We'll talk about the difference between nothing and non-being as we go as well. Therefore, if being can't come from non-being, then something must be eternal. The opposite. Remember, we're using the reductio ad absurdum argument, and we just reduced nothing is eternal to absurdity by showing that it means everything is temporal, everything came into being from non-being. You can't have being from non-being, so this position is not a metaphysically viable position, and it's not a logical option. So on the square of opposition, we erased it. And when we erased it, we had something is eternal, but we also saw that if we had some is eternal and some is not eternal, those two could be true together, or we had some is not eternal and all is eternal. So we had to combine some is and some is not to get a new contradiction. All is eternal or only some is eternal. That was our new contradiction when we did it on the square of opposition. So that's the next point. Either all is eternal or only some is eternal. Now, that is going to give us our logical options for metaphysics. Okay, so let's look at this. What is eternal? Maybe matter, extended and not conscious, or spirit, conscious and not extended, or both, matter and spirit. Okay, matter, spirit, both. Those are our options, right? Now, here's how it gets spelled out in the history of philosophy. Material monism is the position that all that exists is matter and energy, and matter is eternal. So all is one, this one is matter, and this one is eternal. And that was held by the early Greek philosophers that Socrates was engaged with, and it is a position in the modern and postmodern periods of philosophy. So maybe the past 300 years in philosophy, has been a dominant position. But just because it's a dominant position doesn't mean it's true. So we need to critically examine it, just like Socrates did. Now, spiritual monism is an even older position. Spiritual monism is the position that all that exists is spirit, conscious, and it's eternal. There's just one thing, and this one thing is spirit. There is no matter. So matter just appears to us. It isn't real. This is called idealism. All that exists are minds and ideas. Matter does not really exist. Now, historic examples of this include philosophical Hinduism, which says Atman is Brahman. The self is the highest reality, and the self is consciousness. So it's not my individual self, it's the world, the one. There are other philosophical examples of spiritual monism or idealism in the history of philosophy. In the West, Berkeley was a philosopher who was an idealist. He thought all that exists are God and God's ideas, and we are ideas in the mind of God. And then Hegel was another idealist philosopher. He talked about all that exists is the Geist, the spirit, and that spirit is working itself out in history. So that idealism also influences postmodernism to some extent. So these are historic positions, and they're still with us. So they do need to be addressed. We can't just ignore them and say, oh, that's a weird view. Dualism is the position that both matter and spirit are eternal or co-eternal. Both Plato and Aristotle were dualists, and Plato and Aristotle's dualism influences some very notable Christian philosophers. Plato influences St. Augustine, who is one of the first Christian philosophers who's engaged in arguing against the Greek worldview, and he was in that Greek worldview prior to his conversion to Christianity, and he brings some of those views into Christianity. Dualism, maybe this world is matter, and matter is the source of evil, but your soul is good and will go to heaven after this life, and heaven's a better place, right? It's a place of, spirit. And another influential philosopher that is maybe picking up on dualism from Aristotle is St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas is in the 1200s, and he is trying to work out the relationship between faith and reason, and he uses Aristotle. He's also trying to use Aristotle to establish a kind of realism like we're doing here, but he doesn't argue for it. He just uses Aristotle's assumptions, and Aquinas also brings some dualist assumptions into Christian theism. So even though we don't hold to dualism in the way that Plato and Aristotle do, their influence is still with us and has influenced a number of philosophers in the history of philosophy. So we need to address the dualistic metaphysics that is a logical option for some people. And then theism is a position that says there's one spirit, and this spirit is eternal, and it's the creator, or it is God, and all else that exists is temporal or created. So God is a spirit that's eternal, and God created everything that is not eternal. So this is, whereas these three positions, material monism, spiritual monism, and dualism, are considered being and becoming. Being has always existed, it's just becoming something different. Theism is creator and creation, so they're different in that sense. And theism includes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Historically, those are the theist positions. There's also another option called deism that says God is the creator of all that is, but God does not rule or interact with the created order. So they do accept the idea of God the creator, but God doesn't do anything with the creation. He creates it and then he leaves it. We'll try to address those assumptions as we go through as well. But these are the logical options And they were plotted on the square of opposition in contradictory positions where we have all as eternal or only some as eternal. Both can't be true and both can't be false. So if we want to argue for the truth of one of these positions, we have to show the opposite leads to absurdity in the same way we did with some is eternal and nothing is eternal. So as we go, I will try to offer some arguments and show the problems with each of these. It's your job to test the arguments. I will give you valid arguments, which means they're in good form, but you have to test the soundness of these arguments. And the soundness is the truth claims, okay? And so if the argument is sound, you should accept the conclusion if you're committed to reason. If the argument is unsound, you should do me a favor and give me a counter argument so that I can get to the truth as well. That would really make me happy. I accept all kinds of counter arguments and commitment to the rules of common ground first. All right, so next we'll talk about reason and we'll talk about being and non-being. Oh, this could lead to a lot of confusion or to a lot of clarity. So let's explore that next.